I'm chair of the Concord Land Conservation Trust. On behalf of the Land Trust and our event sponsors, I want to welcome you to this program on the conservation of native pollinator systems with Dr. Robert Gegear. Before formally introducing Dr. Gegear, I want to take a moment to recognize the other groups who've helped to make this program possible through their partnership support, including the members of Concord's Pollinator Health Advisory Committee and the students of CCHS's Green Team with Priscilla Guiney, their advisor. Thank you also to the staff of the Concord Free Public Library, Rini, Laura, and Dory, who expertly handled so many of this evening's logistics. And thank you to Delia, Kay, and the Natural Resources Division for your co-sponsorship. And to Land Trust Coordinator Sam Will for putting together such a great display for tonight's program. And many thanks to our Executive Director, Jane Gruba-Chevalier, for conceiving of and planning this terrific evening. If you haven't had a chance to visit the tables in the back, be sure to stop by at the end. You'll be inspired, and if you're looking for information or ways to get involved in work that supports pollinator habitat, these are the groups in Concord you'll want to connect with. And finally, I want to thank the Land Trust members for making programs like this possible and for helping us permanently protect more than 1,300 acres of land in Concord over the past 60 years, which of course is helping all our pollinators to survive. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Robert Gegear. Dr. Gegear is Assistant Professor of Biology at the UMass Dartmouth. His research interests include the conservation of native pollination systems, floral evolution, and bumblebee ecology. The Gegear Lab researches the neuroecology and conservation of plant-pollinator interactions, animal behavior, human psychology, molecular biology, community ecology, and computational biology. There's a lot of ologies in there. Previously, Dr. Gegear taught at Worcester Polytechnic Institute, where he founded the Beecology Project, funded by the National Science Foundation. This initiative uses citizen science to collect much-needed ecological data on native pollinator species and conservation, and pollinator habitat. For his community outreach activities related to wild pollinator conservation, Dr. Gegear was awarded the 2018 Regional Impact Award by the Native Plant Trust. He's organized and presented at scores of workshops and conferences, has been supported by multiple federal grants, and is published in numerous scientific journals and in the popular press. So please welcome Dr. Gegear.
Those are big shoes to fill. So thank you very much for being here. Thank you for the invitation. I did not adjust my slides to the size of the screen, so for those of you at the back, it may be difficult at times. I'll try to explain what's on the slide. So today, as you can tell by my title, I'm going to be talking about how I am using ecological data for the conservation of native plant pollinator systems. I'm doing so at different spatial scales, so anything from a garden up to larger conservation land. And you'll notice in the title of my talk, I've got more than just the buzz. And you notice that I use plant pollinator system or pollination system instead of the term pollinator. And it's not that I have a problem with the term pollinator, it's that I have a problem with how everybody uses or misuses the term pollinator. And the more than just the buzz is referring to the fact that you think of you hear pollinator, immediately you think of bee. For the most part, it's a honeybee. But really what the problem is has nothing to do with the bee at all, right? It has to do with the bee's functional role as a pollinator. And there's a big difference between saving the bees and saving biological systems. And what I hope you get out of today's talk, so I spent a lot of time early on in my talks so that you really understand what a pollinator is and what a pollinator is not. And the key player in all of this is actually the plant. The animal is helping the plant to connect to other wildlife, which is how we're supporting diversity. And for whatever reason, that's lost in all the discussions of pollinators, save the bees, saving one species. And as we'll see today, if we think about plant pollinator systems, we're saving hundreds of species and systems and ecosystem functioning. And so the why it matters is that our human health and well-being depends on the biodiversity that these pollination systems are supporting. So I hope you see those connections. The ecological data that I'm going to talk about comes from my research lab at UMass Dartmouth, so my grad students, and I'm out there all the time collecting data. But it also comes from my Beecology citizen science project that was mentioned. And I know it says Beecology, but you should focus, as was said in the introduction, on the ology part, not the bee part. It's the ecological interactions that separates what I'm doing from what everybody else is doing. Most of the bee-related pollinator conservation efforts are focused on where bees are, right? Which species are there. But what I'm doing, I'm really concerned about, or what I know is important, is what those bees are doing. Who are they interacting with? Are they collecting nectar or pollen? Because if we're going to develop effective conservation, any sort of effective conservation strategy, we need to get rid of the taxonomy. We certainly need to know what these things are and where they are, but bring in the ecology. What do they need to survive and reproduce? And that's what the Beecology project is all about. And I'll talk about how I'm using those data. You know, early on when I was giving these talks, I was trying to get you to join the Beecology project. I certainly still do. We've now moved from bees to butterflies, and we'll move to other bees moving forward. But it was more about data collection. And our data were very clear that certain species like certain things. The next question is, if we put those in the environment, can we restore them in areas where they haven't been observed? And the answer to that is yes. So we're going to talk about, species loss and some negative, but we're going to end on a high note. And you notice I have practical guide. All of this you can do at home. If you have some space, planting the right thing, you'll help conservation efforts. And so with that, we'll just start with a bit of background, the difference between a flower visitor and a pollinator. So as I said earlier on, people use the term pollinator when they're referring to flower visitor. Right? So they're talking about the animal foraging, not its role as a pollinator and the process of pollination. So if we look at animals visiting flowers, so they're visiting flowers to feed on the nectar and pollen. Nectar is their source of fuel, among other things, amino acids, and pollen is their source of protein. So if you're a bee, you need the nectar, or a butterfly, for that fuel. So a bumblebee will survive about 24 hours, a little bit more, maybe without any source of fuel. All right, so they need that constantly. They can't make new bees without pollen. So right away we see that there are two very important components to their life cycle, the fuel, and then they need that good high quality pollen to make new bees. So globally there are about 200,000 of these flower visitors. Of the 200,000, only about 1,000 are vertebrates. So the vast majority of the flower visitors that we see are insects. And certainly the bees are important, but we also have a variety of other things visiting flowers. So we have flies, wasps. If you've seen goldenrod or mountain mint, there's a lot of different smaller insects on there. But the type of environment that they encounter on a daily basis is shown in the background of this slide. So there's a lot in bloom at the same time. They have a lot of choices. And so we have a lot of floral resources, and we also have a lot of competitors, right? All of these animals are competing for a limited resource. And so what this does is it creates a selection pressure. So some of them evolve tricks or evolve certain traits to help them to outcompete others. When we look at this background, flower color is the first thing that pops out, flower odor. And so the question is, how are these animals locating these sources of nectar and pollen? And one of a widely held view out there is that everything is governed by instinct. So they're pre-programmed. So bees prefer blue, butterflies prefer yellow. And it turns out, so the other half of my research, which I'm not talking about today, I study these things to figure out, are they pre-programmed to certain traits? And it turns out that the vast majority of flower visitors are not pre-programmed to visit blue, or they may have certain biases, but what dominates is learning and memory. And so the way that we study this in the lab, just to give you an example, we have a monarch butterfly. Touch the legs of the butterfly with cotton swab soaked in 10 or 20% sucrose solution. The butterfly sticks out its proboscis or its tongue, like Pavlov and Pavlov's dogs. makes contact with the sucrose solution and starts feeding. All right, so that is a fixed, that's an innate response. But what we can do is show the butterfly a color, present an odor, a shape, a combination, a pattern, wait a couple of seconds, and then we touch the legs of the butterfly with the cotton swab again. As soon as its tongue touches that sucrose solution, it forms an association between that color and reward. If it had an innate program, it would have stuck its tongue out right away looking for reward because it has this innate stimulus response, and that's not what we see in monarch butterflies, and I've gone across looked at different colors. In the test phase, again, we're showing novel colors. If it had an innate response, we'd see it sticking its tongue out looking for food. No response, we show a color that's very similar to the training color. We don't see any movement. And then we show then the training color, and we see right away the butterfly sticks out its tongue and starts looking for food. Right? So that's called associative learning. Everything with small brains, large brains do this, but they're forming associations between the color and reward, and they'll use that to guide their choice behavior. Right? The faster they learn, they're going to get the edge on their competitors. Right? So this monarch butterfly, this is a migrant, I believe. Migrants live, obviously they're leave in the fall and they come back in the spring, so they live a long period of time compared to summer butterflies, which live a couple of weeks. This butterfly can remember yellow's rewarding for a month. I can also switch yellow to another color, so we can reverse the learning. We can do a whole bunch of things with them. And so even though they have the brain the size of a pinhead, there's a lot going on there, in addition to them being able to navigate to Mexico without ever having done so before, which is a remarkable navigational feat, which I've also studied, but I don't have time to talk about today. Okay, so that's the learning and memories is guiding them, but also we have, if you look at, I'm not sure if I say anything on these videos or not, usually I don't have sound. But we look at these insects, and they differ in size, and they also differ in tongue length. Right? So here we have Bombus impatiens, which is on a goldenrod. When you land on goldenrod, the nectar is exposed, so the insect, in this case the bumblebee, just has to poke around and get the reward. Pretty straightforward, right? So anything with a short or medium tongue can get at that reward. But when we look at another plant species, so this is jewelweed, we look at the flower. The nectar is located at the base of this spur, right? And so in order to get to that nectar, you need to have a really long tongue. And here we have one of our local bumblebees, one of our targets, which we'll talk about later, Bombus fervidus, has a really long tongue, goes into the flower and wraps its tongue around and can get access to that nectar. So you won't see a short-tongued bee going into that flower legitimately, so going in to get it, because its tongue can't reach the nectar. So from their perspective, the short-tongued bee's perspective, there's no reward there. That isn't even a resource option. The long-tongued bees are competing for that, so it separates them out, right? So we get a fit between the animal and the plant, animal and the flower. If we took our long-tongued bee and put it on the goldenrod, it can't outcompete the short-tongued bees because its tongue gets in the way. It's like an elephant's trunk trying to probe around, where you have a short-tongued bee that's just outcompeting that long-tongued bee. Right? So they have tricks. Some bumblebees will bite holes. So Bombus affinis, which is on the endangered species list, but we still have Bombus terricola in Western Mass that does the same thing. They have a really short tongue, but what they have evolved is a behavior where they rob the flower. They'll bite a hole at the base of the tube and steal the nectar. Right? And so then you have 1,000 honeybees which have short tongue that couldn't get to this legitimately, that then exploit that hole, and you change the competitive dynamic of the system. From the plant's perspective, which we'll get to in a minute, it's not going in the flower, not making contact with reproductive organs. So we're going to start. Right now we're separating out flower visitor from pollinator. Okay. So if these animals, as they're competing and moving through the environment with all these different options, in that process, if they pick up pollen and transfer pollen, right, it doesn't stop there. So when I ask people, I give smaller workshops, and the first question is, what's a pollinator? And people say, oh, it's an animal that transfers pollen. Wrong. All right? Wrong. A pollinator is an animal that transfers pollen that leads to fertilization and the production of seeds and fruit. Right? So, and I'll give you examples in a second of how you can get pollen transfer without any plant reproduction. So the term pollinator has nothing to do with the animal. It has absolutely everything to do with the plant. And for whatever reason, that is lost on people. It's lost on conservation groups. All right? And we're going to see that it's extremely important to understand who the pollinators are and who the pollinators are not if we're going to restore these systems. So for the plant to reproduce, the pollen moves to the stigma. pollen tube growth, we get fertilization taking place. That process, right, ecological process, is pollination. Now, why do we need that fertilization part? Because there are many cases where we have pollen transfer without fertilization. In many plant species, they are what's called self-incompatible. So we may have an inflorescence like this lobelia, the bee or butterfly is moving up, moving pollen from flower to flower, moving up, making contact, so depositing it on the stigma. But because it's self-compatible, it can't fertilize, it can't get fertilized by its own pollen. So lots of pollen transfer, no reproduction, right? Similarly, if I had an individual that would move from my lobelia to this meadowsweet, pollen's being transferred, but it's foreign pollen. It's like us trying to mate with another species. It's just not going to work, right? And there are other issues with that as well. But moving it over, what happens is it blocks the surface of the stigma, the female reproductive organ, and prevents it from meadowsweet from receiving its own pollen. So we have two reproductive costs. The lobelia is wasting its pollen. Its male gametes are being wasted because it's not leading to fertilization. And also, we're getting stigma blockage, which can prevent the meadowsweet from receiving its own pollen and getting fertilization, right? So it's very important that we understand, if we're going to apply the term pollinator, we know what's going on from the plant's perspective. To put this into context, here we have obedient plant, or just to give you another example. Obedient plant, we've got two bumblebee visitors. We've got Bombus fervidus, which we saw in the video, up there on the top right. Bombus fervidus goes into the flower. The nectar is located at the base of the tube, goes in, makes contact with male and female reproductive organs, fertilization, production of seed. Bombus fervidus is a pollinator of obedient plant, okay? Bottom we have Bombus affinis. Bombus affinis I also mentioned. Bombus affinis is biting a hole at the base of that obedient plant flower and stealing the nectar, not making any contact with male and female reproductive organs. So our Bombus affinis is a flower visitor. In fact, our Bombus affinis is a parasite. It's getting something, benefiting, and passing a cost along to the plant. Because when our Bombus affinis takes the nectar, Bombus fervidus comes in and says, hey, this is empty. I'm going to ignore this plant altogether. Right? That's where the learning comes in. They learn to avoid things that don't have nectar, because why would they waste their time? Doesn't make sense, right? So I could have thousands and thousands of Bombus affinis and not have a pollinator. So we can't call Bombus affinis a pollinator, yet people do this all the time. Oh, this is a great pollinator plant, right? So they'll see Bombus affinis on that plant and say, this is a great pollinator plant. No, it's not. In fact, the term pollinator plant drives me somewhat crazy, because you have animal pollinated plants or not. If you have an animal pollinated plant, you either have the pollinator or you do not. So this idea that there are pollinator plants, we need to plant things to help the pollinators, I think is baggage left over from agriculture, right? Where we're trying to save honeybees because they're pollinators of crop plants, and that's inferred. When we switch things to ecology, it's not like that. Right? You need to make sure that the animal and plant are connected together and it's performing its role as a pollinator. It's performing that function. And that's where this pollination system comes in. Similarly, I could have Bombus fervidus, which is also a species of conservation concern. I could replace my obedient plant with a feeder. And I could support, if I could design a feeder and support every bee that's in trouble on the planet, I still have, in terms of conservation, it's fairly meaningless, right? And what I mean by that is, I might be saving one bee, but I'm not protecting or conserving its functional role as a pollinator, because I don't have the plant that it pollinates. And we're going to see why that's important. It isn't about the bee, one species, it's about that pollination event taking place. So if we look at these, so the pollination system then is the plant plus all the animals that pollinate that plant. That's the system. All right. Things that visit it without pollinating it are competitors, and what happens is that the plants evolve traits to deter that type of flower visitor. They don't want Bombus affinis, so they put distasteful things in their floral tissue to try to deter them, which is another side of my research, which I won't talk about today. But what's interesting is Bombus affinis is the poster child for pollinator decline and save the bees. It is not a good pollinator of tubular flowers because it has a trick to rob them. Right? So unless I'm putting in a plant, and Bombus affinis certainly does pollinate other types of flowers with its short tongue, but not this one. And so we need, if we're going to call it a pollinator, let's get the plant in. We can't hope it's going to pollinate something. We need to know that that plant is in the environment that it will pollinate. Okay, so these systems are fairly complex. So here's some data that my grad student, Chelsea Heddering, collected on Penstemon hirsutus. So we went out, we established Penstemon hirsutus populations. We bagged the flowers to see what is the importance of animal pollinators and which animals are most effective pollinators of Penstemon hirsutus. Right? Pretty straightforward experiment. Bag some flowers, count the seeds. So this is the no visit treatment here. You can see that basically it's not producing any seed if it doesn't get a visit by something. Okay? But what's interesting is if we look at that something, so here's open pollination, which means we take the bag off and just let whatever visit for, as long as that flower is in bloom. So pretty good seed production. Here we have Bombus vagans, a long-tongued bumblebee. Here we have small bees. So you can see that our Bombus vagans is a much better pollinator of Penstemon hirsutus than our smaller bees. These error bars reflect the fact that in many cases these small bees go in for nectar and they don't pollinate at all. So we may have a ton of small bees buzzing around and everybody's like, oh, this is a great bee plant. Well, yes, but the question is, are they actually pollinating that plant or are they just feeding on that plant? And when we look at another level of complexity, here we have the pineland golden trumpet. Here's everything that was observed visiting those flowers for nectar. Right? So we've got butterflies, we've got short and long-tongued bees. The ones in green are actually pollinating. The rest of them are not. So I may have a dozen species visiting that plant, collecting nectar. Without those 3, I have no pollination taking place. It's all flower visitors. Similarly, I could have just those 3 and keep that system alive. So hopefully you can see that we need to look a bit closer, not just at what's visiting, but what they're doing behaviorally and how that's impacting the plant to understand the relationship between those two things. So these pollination systems are diverse. So as I said, the plants, so we look at it from the animal side, they're competing for nectar and pollen. Plants are competing for animal pollinators. And so they're targeting certain groups of animals. Some are targeting small bees, some are targeting large bees, some are targeting long-tongued animals, which could be bees, hummingbirds. Some are just targeting hummingbirds. Here we have, on the bottom left, we have a system where it's a fly plant, and it's highly specialized, meaning if the fly goes extinct, so does the plant, and if the plant goes extinct, so does the fly. It's a highly specialized system. Others are generalized, like the Penstemon hirsutus, where it's not going to get pollinated as well, but if we lose some of the pollinators, they have a bit of a backup system, right? And you'll notice in the top with the bumblebee, you'll notice that the pollen, that yellow, is on the thorax of the bee. And in the hummingbird, the pollen is on the forehead of the hummingbird. Why? Because those flowers want to maximize, those plants want to maximize pollen transfer efficiency. So if they put the pollen, in the case of the bumblebee, somewhere where it's easily groomed off, it's wasting, it's a cost from the plant side, right? The bees love it because they're getting lots of pollen, but the plants don't want that. So there's a struggle. People think plant-pollinator interactions, this wonderful mutualism. It is absolutely not. It is a battle, right? Their interests don't line up. The plant manipulates the bee or the butterfly to help it to reproduce. And then, so there's this co-evolutionary battle, if you will, that's going on. For the hummingbird, if the plant deposited it on the wings, the hummingbird's not going for the pollen, but that's obviously not a very efficient way to transfer your pollen. So they evolved tricks. So in the case of that hummingbird pollinated flower, here's the female reproductive structure. The bird moves in, the nectar is located at the base of the flower. The bird moves in and transfers the pollen when it rubs its forehead against the female part and then picks up pollen as it's feeding. So they have tricks. Here's a butterfly. All of what you see here in the front, you probably can't see this at the back, all these little specks, that's all pollen. So butterflies, everything, flies, they're all transferring pollen, and they can all function as pollinators. So certainly bees, and some bees are more efficient than other bees, but there are plants that are targeting flies. There are plants that are targeting beetles. Right? It's not just about the bees. Okay, so what's the issue then? So hopefully you now understand what a system is. The problem is that these systems are being degraded globally, both from the animal side of the equation and the plant side of the equation. All right. So from the animal side, there's some data from bumblebees in Massachusetts. I looked at historical records, went back to the same sites and collected to see what was there. You can see that, so yellow is current and blue is historic, and you can see in many cases the yellow bars are below the blue bars. In some cases, like Bombus affinis, there is no yellow bar because it's likely locally extinct, although I have hope that there's still a population somewhere isolated. Similarly with butterflies. So I reanalyzed a lot of the Mass Butterfly Club data that was publicly available from 2010 to 2018, the same way they did in previous publications. And you can see that there are a lot of butterfly species that are in decline. And not surprisingly, a lot of our native plants are in decline. And those native plants in decline, not surprisingly, are pollinated by the animals in decline, right? Because of that relationship. So that's fine. But what I want to point out here, and this is another misconception people have, is that everything is in trouble. It is absolutely not. There are species of bumblebee that are more abundant and more widespread than they were historically. The same with butterflies. All those green bars are butterfly species that actually have increased over the same time that some are decreasing and becoming locally extinct. The same with our native plants. So this tells us right away that if we want to conserve things, we cannot use a one-size-fits-all approach. We can't treat bees as one thing or plants as one thing. We need to start to look at the species that are in trouble and figure out what those traits are that we're influencing to cause those declines. So why should we care? So when this idea of pollinator decline started, it was all about agriculture and honeybees and colony collapse disorder. So honeybees are non-native. They play a tremendously important role in agricultural context, no question, right? And so in an agricultural context, what matters is you can imagine you've got acres and acres of one thing and bloom for a couple of weeks that isn't native. So you've got a handful of plants pollinated by, for the most part, honeybees, but there are some native bees, a handful that will do the pollinating. Out of the thousands of native bee species that we have, only about 5%, 8% actually pollinate crop plants. So that's another problem, that if you're going to conserve pollinators on agricultural lands, you're going to miss the ones that don't care about crop plants, right? But the main point is that you need abundance. It's all about abundance. It does not matter what you have. What matters is that you have enough of something to get all that pollination done of a single species. The products of that pollination, right, which is the important part, the pollination and the products of pollination, the seeds produced, the fruit, the plant material, all of that, those are what I call pollination products, are important for one species, and that's us, which is clearly very important. That's agriculture. But when we shift things to an ecological perspective, what matters, certainly abundance matters to some degree, but what matters is diversity. Imagine you've got all these systems. All of these plants are producing different types of seeds and fruit that taste differently and have different qualities. Plant material that forms different nesting substrate, right? Different types of shelter. That diversity is the basis of our ecosystems. So the seeds and fruit produced from the pollination events are feeding small mammals and birds, and those small mammals and birds are then feeding predatory species. Everything is connected, right? So with the diversity of pollination systems, we're able to support a diversity of wildlife and interactions between them. Why is this important? Agriculture, obviously, important for human health and well-being. Also, economically, multi-billion-dollar industry. Who cares about losing a few bees that aren't important agriculturally? Well, healthy and diverse ecosystems provide us with ecosystem services. These are things like carbon sequestration, water purification, things we get from nature for free that we totally take for granted. So as we start to erode the bottom layer by removing these systems, so the plant and the animal, we're going to have cascading effects. Eventually, we're going to get what's called ecosystem collapse, a massive reduction in biodiversity, and we're going to lose those services. Some of them we can't replace. Others, if we can replace them, there's a hefty price tag associated with it. So it's in our best interest to try to keep as much diversity going for an extended period of time. And when I say diversity, people think species. I'm not thinking species, I'm thinking interactions. The plant interacting with all of this wildlife and supporting it. We need to think more system level and less species level if we're really going to make a difference and protect and restore these system functions. So to give you an example that people always are upset about, but I have to do it. Here we have hummingbird pollinated monarda, right? And we also have hummingbird feeders. Everybody loves their hummingbird feeders. They do a great job feeding hummingbirds, right? And hummingbirds, if they had the choice between a feeder and a flower, they visit 100 flowers to get the same amount as, about 10 seconds on a feeder. They're not dumb. They're going to go for the feeder. right? So we're supporting a large hummingbird population with our feeder, but if we gave instead we placed it with Monarda, right? So they're feeding and they're pollinating the Monarda. Monarda is the host plant for the orange mint moth. The seeds of Monarda are feeding purple finch. Those adult orange mint moths are being fed by eastern whippoorwills, and the larval stage, if you've ever listened to Doug Talmy saying the same thing I am, just focusing in a different way, but looking at the larval stage, that's a major source of food for birds. So here I'm saving one species, I'm saving the bee. Here I'm saving its functional role as a pollinator, and you can see that when it comes to the number of species and connections, clearly the left option is much better. Now, let's replace our feeder with a non-native species. It's possible that our hummingbird loves European honeysuckle and actually might pollinate it. The problem is the birds don't like the seeds, the butterflies don't want to use it as a host plant, so we're effectively doing the same thing. We're shutting down all that diversity by having these native plants. So it isn't just about, again, feeding the animals. You might see tons of bees on a non-native species, but unless you have all those connections, and for the most part you don't, then you're losing that biodiversity. All right? Okay. So what's causing this? We're clearly the problem. What are we doing? We're doing many things that, it's a problem. Pesticides clearly have a negative effect on these systems. Climate change is shifting things, putting things out of sync, right? So you have flowers in bloom before their pollinators emerge from the winter, or the reverse. The pollinators are out looking for food and nothing's in bloom. So there's a mismatch. Disease, we've got pathogens moving from honeybees to native bees. We've got pathogens moving from native bees that are used commercially into wild bees, which is thought to be a contributing factor. But I think everyone would agree that the main driving force for the degradation of these systems is habitat loss or habitat change, some sort of modification. All right? So the question is, what habitat? Like, why is it that some species are declining and others are thriving under the same conditions? And to figure these things out, my approach is, well, let's ask the species what they need and figure out what they need and then see if we're affecting it in some way. So it's a pretty straightforward ecological approach, but you have to understand the life history of the species in question. And unfortunately, we don't know much about the life history. So for bumblebees, we know next to nothing about overwintering, and we know very little about nesting, right? Those are major parts of the life cycle of a bumblebee and also other bees, right? So they are overwintering. They need a good place to overwinter where they don't freeze to death. They come out at this time of the year and they're looking for a nest site. And each species is going to have a different nesting preference, right? Each species has its own niche, right? They need nectar and pollen. The nectar is the fuel, the pollen to make new bees to keep that population going. For butterflies, they need a host plant, right? And they need a nectar source of fuel. So you can have the most beautiful butterfly garden in the world. If you don't have that host plant, you aren't going to have the butterflies that you're trying to attract. So we need to think more comprehensively about this. For plants, we know shockingly little about the mating system and pollinators of most of our native plants, right? So if we're losing plants and they depend on seed bank and they need a certain pollinator, obviously that's important to know. It's good information for trying to develop an effective conservation strategy, right? And it's going to differ based on this, vary from species to species. So because we have this knowledge gap, what I did and started in about 2015 when I finished working on monarch butterflies at UMass Medical, where they told me I couldn't even say the word bee, let alone study bees. I decided that, I was looking at the plant lists that were put out to save the bees and pollinator plants and pollinator habitats and pollinator this, and I realized that what they would generalize and say, this is good for bees. Well, I knew full well, and anybody studying bumblebees knows they differ in tongue length and they don't prefer the same thing. And there were some other issues, and so what I decided to do was get some data to figure out what exactly do they like, right? These patterns through publications are there, but let's see what they actually prefer, and do the species in decline prefer different things than the species that are stable or increasing, right? So I started collecting data from a bunch of sites across Massachusetts, target bumblebees. So historically, on the right, those are the bumblebee species that were historically present in the state, the social ones, and social species, and the ones in red are the ones that are of conservation concern, based on data collected across their range in eastern North America, plus the data that I showed you based on museum specimens and local collections. The problem, so early on I noticed some very obvious patterns that for whatever reason weren't making it onto these plant lists or weren't reflected in these plant lists. And so I needed more data, and I was just myself and a grad student, so I knew a lot of people were interested in this issue. And so I created the Ecology Citizen Science Project, where I got individuals, citizen scientists, to go out and collect data on, remember, the interaction between bumblebees, to start, bumblebees and flowers. What was the species? Was it a male worker or queen? Was it collecting nectar or pollen? Right? That type of information. And to help that, I teamed up with, to help facilitate the collection early on, take a short video, never take a picture. Short video, you can ID species with a high level of accuracy. You know the behavior. You can't tell behavior from a picture. Right? So sending me videos of interactions into our database through a web app, the Ecology web app. So teamed up with some faculty at Worcester Polytechnic Institute in the computer science and computational biology side of things. And we developed the website, and we started to collect ecological data. So this is just showing you the web app. So if you go to the Ecology website, you can use the app. So it started with bumblebees, and now we've expanded out to butterflies, which I'll get to in a minute. At the same time, so I sent out citizen scientists to collect data. At the same time, I'm doing rigorous surveys. So walking transects, same way, controlling for this, that, and the other thing. And just to show you the results for 1 month at one site, here we have the bumblebee species down here. The ones circled in red are the bumblebee species of conservation concern, short, medium, and long tongue. And we can see generally there's a pattern. Not surprisingly, long tongue bees like tubular flowers. That's not shocking. Short tongue bees like milkweed, they like goldenrod, right? But what's interesting is within the groupings, I noticed some patterns. So all of these bees were in the same place at the same time. They had the same access to resources, and this is what they were doing. And you'll notice the proportion of visits. So in some cases, in the case of Bombus terricola, 80% of its visits, so like 100 individuals, were to milkweed. There's a very clear preference to milkweed. Even though all these other species were available, these species were partitioning themselves based on tongue length for the most part. But you'll notice here, Bombus impatiens is the bee that's the common eastern bumblebee. It's very common. It's, you know, if you're going to see something late August, it's going to be Bombus impatiens. It had showed a high preference for purple loosestrife and vetch, but none of the other bees like purple loosestrife, right? Even though the purple loosestrife was there, they were preferring the milkweed or bush honeysuckle. Or so here we've got a long-tongued bee, Bombus vagans, all over the red clover and vetch. But we can see there are differences there that vagans like the native bush honeysuckle. So that's for nectar, okay? For pollen, things were even more dramatic in terms of preference. So if you look at bees actively collecting pollen in the same landscape, so they were doing nectar, those bees collecting pollen from two things, meadowsweet and St. John's wort. So that tells me that those are high quality pollen sources. The bees are telling me that, right? The other one that we saw a lot of activity on, purple flowering raspberry. Tons, not just bumblebees, all sorts of bees were all over these plants for pollen. And if you look at the nectar plants, very few of them were actually collecting pollen from those nectar plants. So they're either doing nectar or pollen. There was this partitioning, which is very interesting. So the question is then, if we go back to this, this slide, red clover is a non-native, right, and vetch. And so we have our three target bumblebee species of conservation concern, all over vetch red clover. The question is, what native species, who's their native species partner, right? So they're pollinating a non-native. They've lost the connection with the native plant and the wildlife. What exactly were they doing? So looking at ecology data, looking across sites, I was able to put together the preferred native plants. So if these plants are in the environment, they tend to visit these plants over the red clover, right? So looking at the spring, wood betony all the way to monarda. So this is just nectar plants getting through the season. All those bees were showing a strong preference for those tubular flowers, which isn't surprising. But except for the showy goldenrod, and showy goldenrod is very different from the other goldenrods. Again, When it comes to goldenrods, one size does not fit all as well. Showy goldenrod is very different in terms of what it attracts than the other goldenrods. So the question then is, okay, they're showing these strong preferences. Does it matter? Does it matter that other than the pollination part, let's just look at bee nutrition. Is red clover as good as a penstemon? And the answer, or St. John's wort, Hypericum. The answer is no. So these are data pulled from a publication by Christina Grozinger's group at Penn State. So it's on the y-axis, how much protein pollen per milligram pollen. Hairy beard tongue, Penstemon hirsutus, is through the roof, by far, right? In red, we have the non-native clovers. So we don't have penstemons in the landscape. We've got red clover. The pollen's crappy. Bees need good pollen to make new bees. Could it drive decline? The answer is yes. And by the way, the preference of Bombus fervidus for red clover, I've been to sites where we see fervidus, they mow the red clover, no fervidus for the rest of the season. Meanwhile, there's tons of other things in bloom. So there's a strong preference there. But you put in the penstemons, you put in Monarda, those, not only are those fervidus there, but the numbers over the last couple of years have increased because the pollen is high quality, so they're able to put out more bees. All right? Okay, so as I mentioned, this past year, we introduced the butterfly ID. So we were able to get the API from iNaturalist. So now you can take a picture of the butterfly from the video, a still, send it to iNaturalist, IDs you for, comes back to our app, it'll help you ID the plant, and then it'll send it to the database. So we're starting to collect data on butterflies as well. And I have a grad student that's been collecting data on butterflies. So the same idea. Right? Butterflies, short, long tongue. There's no reason to suspect that butterflies are preferring the same plants. For the same reason we don't think that bees wouldn't be visiting the same plants because of that competition and resource partitioning. And so she surveyed, or they surveyed multiple sites over the last couple of years across the state and found very clear patterns with the butterflies. So here we have common ringlet. If we look at just tube length, do they like long tube flowers or medium short tube flowers? In the case of common ringlet, only 3% of the flowers had a long tube, so they were visiting milkweed and things without a long tube. At the bottom, one of the target species, silver spotted skipper, 90% of the flowers had a long tube of a few hundred observations. So very clear preference for long tube. Some species, right, also had preference for native plants. So in case of those clear wings, native plants and long tube, that combination accounted for the vast majority of the observations. The eastern tail blue, host plants legume, 100% of the foraging visits we recorded were on legumes. Right? This is multiple sites, the same pattern, and of course, other areas, like we continue to collect data, but these patterns are there as well. So if we're going to start to save butterflies, we're going to have to think about which species are we trying to save, what's the host plant, and what nectar plants are we going to put in. All right, so all of these data go into my plant list. And so this is available on my website. And so despite the fact that there are these clear preferences at the species level, there are still plant lists out there, these pollinator-friendly plants or pollinator plant lists. This one, I'm not picking on Native Plant Trust, but this is the one I was looking at the catalog, and I noticed that this is a pollinator kit. And when you look through the plants, again, any plant that has nectar is going to attract something. All right? The question is, if we're going to save pollinators and help pollinators, well, first of all, we're not, like the term helping pollinators is virtually meaningless, right? We have a plant that we need pollinated. We need to make sure that the pollinator's there. So we're helping the system by introducing the plant and having the pollinator there. But these, as I said, those long-tongued bees are looking for specific things, and they need them from spring all the way through their cycle, which is late summer, early fall. And so the Monarda and the foxglove, the digitalis, penstemon, great. What are they doing in the spring, right? Where are I showed you that there are very clear pollen preferences across bees, but there are no pollen plants here. And so bees are treated as this one-size-fits-all. Butterflies, this is great for bees, this is great for butterflies. Well, maybe some common, but not the targets. So if your goal is conservation, your goal is we want to restore these systems and help the things that need it, we just need to fine-tune our lists and what we plant. All right, so now transitioning from we have the data, I'm pretty confident that these patterns are there. So if we change environments and put these plants into the environments, are we going to see a positive impact? So during COVID, I started to establish these ecology conservation sites. Dartmouth and Southborough, Breakneck Hill were my first two sites. And so we had a lot of volunteers putting in plants, plugs, and shrubs that bloomed the first year. As soon as those plants started to bloom, guess who showed up? So these are all pictures of target bumblebees on plants in the habitats. Most of them are the first year. The one in the middle, the showy goldenrod, it was the second year. And this was happening not just at Breakneck, but every site. And at Breakneck, there are 40 acres there. Some years I wouldn't see a single Fervidus. This past year, I saw a dozen in that habitat. All right, so from my perspective, pretty dramatic results. The other thing is, it isn't just putting in plants, it's unlocking native biodiversity, native plant diversity. So Breakneck Hill, 40 acres. Down here, it's all purple loosestrife. And so purple loosestrife, surveyed the purple loosestrife. I showed you some data. It's all honeybees and Bombus impatiens, the common bees, right? Things that don't need attention. None of the targets, right? So we removed the purple loosestrife, and a couple things happened. First of all, it unlocked all this native diversity. So all of these plants, especially the mimulus up on the left, wasn't there while the loosestrife's there. Get rid of the loosestrife, the native diversity comes up. And so I surveyed a huge population of mimulus. That's Bombus vagans, and on the same plant, that's Bombus fervidus. On the same plant, those targets were there on those plants, which has never happened before and certainly wasn't there when the loosestrife was there. So we don't just need to add, getting rid of invasives and seeing what you have that you don't know about is also an effective conservation strategy. So that was year 3, and those numbers have been increasing over the past couple of years. The other thing is that, as I said, honeybees are extremely important in agriculture. They have no business on conservation lands. Why? Because they are competitors. They are taking a limited resource, and they are in high numbers, right? A single honeybee hive, thousands, tens of thousands of individuals. So what, right? Well, here we have Monarda. So these are some data from Lincoln. People from Pollinators were doing some work there. So here I'm showing you what I observed the last week of July and the first week of August. So last week of July, I saw Fervidus and vagans all over. Nice fit between tube. They love Monarda rubra, Monarda fissulosa. I noticed a couple of carpenter bees. Carpenter bees are nectar robbers. They bite holes at the base. They're opening up the resource. The next week, I show up, hundreds of honeybees. So this is one observation period. There were over 100 honeybees on that Monarda. Not a single Bombus fervidus or vagans. They got pushed right off the resource because that nectar robber opened it up. If those honeybees weren't there, that system is stable. Honeybees knock it out of balance, right? And so we're now pushing our target species to a lower quality resource where the competition isn't as great, all right? Looking at mountain mint, which everybody loves, which is great for honeybees, but not for the species of conservation concern. But just to give you an idea of numbers, the common bumblebee, the most common bumblebee that's in the hundreds, thousands, it's still 100 honeybees for a dozen common bumblebees that are really common. And the same goes for most of the goldenrods. So you see a lot of bees in activity. Remember, there's a difference between abundance and diversity. We want to focus on the diversity. How many things, not how much of one thing. So what can you do at home? So all of what you see here is in 1/4 of an acre. So I live in Framingham, 1/4 of an acre. All of this is in bloom. And, again, my lawn was typical lawn, had white clover, dandelion, things that do absolutely nothing. Versus now, these are pictures. Here's Bombus vagans on my foraging at my house, but I have willow with this around it, and then there are these ground nesting bee nests. So lots going on. So you don't need much space to have a positive impact. Now I want to finish just talking about cultivars and hybrids. That when I say native plants, I'm talking straight species. So here we have various cultivars. The problem with cultivars is that when you breed for something, you give something up. So let's say I want a showy flower. Let's say I want a pink flower. The plant has limited resources. If some resources go to changing color, more often than not, it affects nectar production, right? So Annie White from University of Vermont looked at preference for straight species versus cultivars. So this is just looking at echinacea. The colored bars represent the color. So the left is the straight species, the right are the cultivars. And you can see in the case of bumblebees and that white one, there's a significant reduction in visitation. So the plant looks great. Well, it's an echinacea. It's a great plant, right? Wrong. Why? Because it likely has been compromised in some way in terms of nectar production, nectar quality. There could be other things driving that difference. Looking at a hybrid cultivar of Lobelia cardinalis, right? So what Annie did was looked at the nectar content. Here's the straight species. Here's the hybrid. So a very clear difference. I told you at the beginning of this talk, it's all about nectar and pollen and fuel. And although it looks great to us, if it doesn't look great to the species, then there's a problem, right? So looking at this, unfortunately, so when you're buying plants, you need to make sure that you avoid the cultivars. The way you can tell is they often have catchy names in quotes, right? So looking through the catalog selectively, so this is the Native Plant Trust catalog, it's great to see these plant species, Penstemon hirsutus, Syphilitica, and Prunella. A couple of years ago, these plants weren't available. And they're on my list, and they are high quality resources that should be put in, right? So they're selling them if you want to buy them. Not so good. This is that white echinacea that I showed you bumblebees don't like, right? So you just, again, be selective in what you put in. So just to finish the talk, right, we're talking about these pollination systems and connections to other wildlife. Are we seeing any evidence of that in these habitats? And the answer is yes. So here is Breakneck Hill. We've got Bombus vagans, a target bumblebee visiting shrubby St. John's wort, collecting the pollen, high quality pollen. This is the same plant, or a plant in the same grouping in the fall, and this is a white-throated sparrow feeding on the seeds, which is a bird species of conservation concern. So now we have that connection. We're restoring the whole system. These birds like to forage close to the ground with cover, and shrubby St. John's wort provides the best of everything, and we're starting to see them when we wouldn't see them at that site previously. And just to finish, this is purple giant hyssop gone to seed, and hopefully you can see from the back all the activity. There are more than a dozen birds feeding on the purple giant hyssop seeds. And you know, I tried to look at different species. I know there are multiple species there, but I'm not a birder, so I need to get somebody that is into birds to start surveying these habitats to look for the connections between the native plant and wildlife. And once we get that information together, we can start to go into areas and construct these functional systems and restore our native biodiversity. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much for your time, and happy to take any questions. Everybody tired like me and no questions? Yes, go ahead.
You have a butterfly grid similar to your endangered bee species grid.
I do, yes. So it is going to be, so the one I have, the list I have on my website right now is based on 2 publications. So what I did was took the data and just looked at the past 10-ish years, so from 2010 to 2018. And so I have a new list that I'm going to update on my website. It isn't there yet, but it will be there in the next week or so. I have the list, I just haven't put it on the site yet. And I will adjust my plant species list accordingly because there are different host plants that they need. And so if you look at my plant list, it has the host plants that correspond to the butterflies. And then I'll also have where they occur in the state, so you know who to expect in your area, just like with the bees. Yes?
A non-native St. John's wort that just volunteered itself in my yard, is that not really valuable?
No, so, good question. So she has some non-native shrubby St. John's wort,
It's not shrubby, it's just.
or sorry, non-native St. John's wort, and just like with the red clover, right? So the idea isn't to go out and start to mow all the non-natives, because that's what's keeping these species from becoming locally extinct, right? What you want to do is have a strategy where you introduce the native, and as they start to use the native and that takes hold, then you remove the non-native, right? So this is all about strategy. It's going to take some time and some planning, but it's certainly doable. And we've been doing that at various sites where when we have these populations established, we can start mowing the red clover, and they'll move over to the higher quality resource if they haven't found it, right? Because they need to find it over 40 acres, which is that can be a problem. But keep it until you can get the natives in there and then swap. Yes?
Where do you suggest finding native plants to buy or seeds to start from?
Yeah, so there are a bunch of places. So Native Plant Trust is one. Ernst Seeds has some, but you got to ask them where the seeds are coming from. There's Northeast Pollinator Plants. It's in it's either Vermont or Maine. A Blue Stem Nursery, Wing and a Prayer Nursery. If you're in Western Mass in Cummington, if you want me to, just email me if you want me to give you a list and tell me where you live, and I can tell you the closest place. And you know, the other thing that I'm doing is if you want to establish one of these habitats, we're collecting seed from the habitats and then having, and I'm not doing this, is, you know, Freddie Gillespie and Southborough is doing it, and some other groups are doing it, where you collect seeds from the habitats, grow up them, and then use those seeds to distribute in the community, which has been really effective. That people have been getting the plants, not only the plants in their yards, but they're starting to collect data and they're seeing the species that we're targeting. So it's very exciting in more urban areas. Yes?
Thank you for this. I learned so much. And I wonder if you know if there's anything happening at the policy level so that it's not as easy for us to walk into like a Home Depot and buy something that's going to be harmful and we don't even realize it.
So let me say that it's not, so the harmful part, if it has pesticides, so there's that issue. But in terms of any native plant is a good plant, all right? I'm not trying to say that the native plants I have are the only good plants. What I'm saying is, if we want to conserve, that we need to be more targeted, and so I'm looking at native plants from the perspective of these systems and trying to keep system diversity going. But they play important roles in other ways. So in terms of the short answer is no. You know, you could sell the cultivars, you can do ornamentals, whatever, and it's up to you. And to be honest, if you want to keep a garden and you want a nice showy flower, if that's your goal, that's fine. If your goal is conservation, though, then I would suggest you think about some of the things that I'm talking about today. But in terms of policy, other than the pesticide policies trying to be pushed through, but in terms of plant availability, I'm not sure. I don't think so. Yes?
Could you talk a little bit about habitat in general? For instance, we hear that oaks host a great number of species.
Yep, a butterfly, yep.
But it's not on your list of.
Absolutely it is.
plants.
Absolutely it is.
Where?
Under host plants. So you don't have my list. I can tell right now. So, well, I mean, so my list looks like it's on my website, and it looks like. So I'll put up, my website was on the last slide, and I'll bring it to your attention. But my plant list looks like this. So I've got pollen sources, nectar, and I've got host plants. And oak, willow, all of those are extremely important, and they're listed as host plants. And there was a question earlier about the butterflies. I need to update the list. It's not going to change too much. But there are grasses, native grasses. So I took out a couple slides for the sake of time. Native grasses are extremely important host plants for a lot of skippers and other things. And they're nesting substrate for small mammals that feed birds, but also our bumblebees, the Bombus fervidus, uses abandoned rodent nests as a nest. So if we get rid of the rodents, we're affecting the bees. So it doesn't matter what we plant. So, you know, not cutting, having pithy stems for stem nesting bees and not cutting them to the ground. These are not blowing the leaves, which I add to the talk in the fall. Now we're sort of past that, but for spring cleanup, you should leave it, because that's literally and figuratively leave it. Because that's, they're coming out from winter, and they're also digging in and using that as habitat. So I do have those host plants, and they're just as important as the nectar plants. And my grad student is putting together, based on data, we're starting to get the butterfly. Yes?
Do you have any guidelines on your website as far as when to prune, how to keep up the plants? Like example, like you just talked about the native grasses,
Right. So the short answer is you always leave it. And I know that that isn't practical for many homeowners. And I don't have, there isn't really a good time to do it, because they're constant. Like some of the bees are nesting in those stems for 2 years. So you leave it till the spring, you cut it, those bees are gone because they were nesting till the following year. And so it's, blowing the leaves off of a turf grass lawn into areas, flower beds, and leaving it like that is preferable, if you have to blow leaves. But messy is good. I don't know. I don't have a recommendation. It's not, maybe from your neighbor's perspective, it's not good. But if you tell them what you're doing, maybe they would. Some of them would. Some of them will call the police and give you a citation. But
what happens if you live in a condominium complex? How do you convince them that?
Well, so going after landscapers and trying to get them to switch to native straight is a challenge, but some headway is being made in various places. So I will say that Weston, so I had a chat with Weston Nursery. They were sort of resistant to native plants because they said they don't make money, but I noticed that they now have native plants for sale, straight species, and pretty good ones that, some of them that are on my list. So I was very impressed to see that. So, and it's just because people are aware and they're asking for it that they're going to change is happening. And I see everything as positive change, and I am definitely seeing positive impacts in the field. So, the Beecology project, phase 2 is you have a parcel of land, you put in my plants, and I use them as experimental plots so that I can see who are the pollinators, how well is this doing in this particular habitat. So all of you are participating in the scientific process. Originally it was data collection, now it's implementation, from data to conservation action, so I can get these plots and start to look at impacts on other wildlife, and we can start to understand these connections better and then improve conservation strategies moving forward. Yes?
So do you gather, I heard you a year and a half ago, and I'm on board.
Well, informed decisions is all I'm about. I appreciate that, but.
But I recognize that I lack so much knowledge because I'm using your list, but it's static. I don't have you as a resource. Do you gather people that are trying to do their backyard gardens, or is there a location where people that are attempting to implement?
Yes.
And what is that?
So there's a site, Giancarlo is here, there's a site in Chelmsford, there's a site in Southborough where I've established these habitats, so you can look at the plants, you can look at the impact they're having, you could even collect seed if you wanted to. And I'll say that, I'm busy, but anybody that's asked me about plantings, I've answered their question and they tell me what they have and I've made recommendations. So, I'm available as a resource. And I understand that, I have, you need things from spring to fall from the different categories, but really if you had to give 8 plants, what would it be? And that slide I showed you of what I have in my yard seems to be doing a pretty good job just with that subset. But you have different soil types, different lighting conditions, and you have to play with that a little bit. But I'm more than happy to give you suggestions and help you and come and survey your property and see what you have. A lot of this too, the citizen science is, I want you to, and I give workshops, see what you have now, make a change, and see what you have after. I don't want you to just trust me. I want you to see that you've made a difference. That's very important to me. A lot of this is, here's a list, a plant list. So let's use the plant list. I want you to just document what's there. Video, record it and put it in a Google Drive and ask me to look at it, right? Put in the plants and then see what's there after, and see that you've made a change. And if it didn't change, if it changed in a different way, I can still use that data to tweak plant selection and various things. Okay? Yes?
You never mentioned moths. I know that's harder because they fly, most of them fly at night, but I just wondered if you've done any research.
I have. So I have 2 years of moth data, and I haven't been able to put it together. I need more moth data. But moths are on my radar and have been for the last 3 or 4 years. I will say that the moths are visiting a lot, like Monarda is. So in terms of bang for your buck, Monarda fistulosa is huge in terms of the number of connections it makes with species of conservation concern, bees, butterflies, and moths. Yeah, I haven't put those data together yet, and it's coming. Maybe next year, if I give this talk. I try to change my talks every time because some people, I'm sure everybody's getting sick of me at this point, but I try to add new things in, and so moths, that's my next, once I have time to think about the moth data. But I do have 2 years of data that Adam Cole in Western Mass collected for me, and he knows how to ID, and he was doing interaction data, so stay tuned. Yes? But there, no.
We have honeybees, and you can, listening to you, you think, okay, that's a really bad thing. So I guess my question is, hammer cake and eat it too. Can I make my honeybees happy and enjoy them and enjoy the honey as well as help biodiversity?
Right. So let me step back a bit. So if you're putting honeybees in, so a lot of people are promoting honeybees, saying if you want to save the environment, put honeybees in your backyard or on a rooftop, right? That's just not the case. If you have honeybees, you have honeybees. I mean, again, it's informed decisions. What I will say is if you want to minimize the impact of honeybees, the way that you plant is important. What do I mean by that? If you have a large clump of one thing that doesn't have a long tube, you're going to get a lot of honeybees. Because what they do is they're recruiting based on what they perceive the resource size to be. If you took that same clump and put a quarter over there, a quarter in that corner, a quarter here, and a quarter there, you won't get as many honeybees. You can keep them, you can minimize them. Even though you have the same resource, and the bees that like it aren't going to care. They'll go all around because they're individual. They're not going back to a hive to, you're giving them misinformation, even though it's the same amount of resource. That's how you trick them. And that's how I've been able to trick them, and that's what I'm looking at and doing in the field. Yes?
Are there any available seed mixes, commercially or otherwise, that largely replicate or could be complemented with plugs?
Yeah, so...
Public project on our riverway in our town.
Yeah. So excellent question. So I've found more success with the plug method in terms of establishment. Some of the plants like prunella can fill in pretty quickly. The problem with seed mixes is you never know what's actually going to come up. But you know, I've used earned seeds and I've been trying to seed larger areas, and I don't have a green thumb. I've got a plot that I'm trying this summer, so I'll say that I don't want to give you, so earned seeds where I got seed mixes from that have some of what's on my list, and I'm figuring out how to do that effectively.
The challenge is, some of it has to be seeds, but you can also do plugs.
Right, so my strategy was plug spaced with seeds and trying to get the population established that way. Plus you've got plugs and seeds coming from different places, so you've got genetic variation, which is important. So, so I'll say Ernst, but stay tuned. I know there are a lot of seed collection efforts going on, but I'm not sure that those seeds are available.
Feel like any of the mixes out of New England wetland?
Oh yeah. So yeah, they would be all right, I think. Assuming they don't have, I don't think they have hybrids and cultivars. That's another place to get native plants that I forgot to mention because it's farther west, and I didn't know they had seed mixes, but if they do, if it has the plants that would cover what's on my list, then it's, yeah, great. I think they would be fine. He's asking for where do you get seed mixes? And so he said New England wetland plants, which is another source for native plants that I forgot about and have used, and the plants were good quality, but I didn't know that they had seed mixes, but apparently they do. Yes?
Beyond the plants, what other recommendations would you have for behaviors on our home or, you know, here in Concord for reducing lights or mosquito broadcast?
Yes, so all insects are good. Insect diversity is good, so spraying is reducing the diversity, which is going to have a negative impact. Certainly light pollution is an issue for not just, you know, moths and anything nocturnal. It can disrupt circadian rhythms, foraging patterns, predation risk. But that is not my wheelhouse. So I will say that those are definitely our concerns, but in terms of what to do, I could look into it, but I don't have answers off the top of my head. But they're valid issues. I know that. Yeah. Yes?
Somebody had a list of all the native habitats, types of native habitats. Which ones would have the most pollination systems in them?
So it varies. I mean, I think that if you go to there are, so system diversity is at that scale. In terms of the number of systems, diversity of systems, that's an excellent question. I will say that human disturbed habitats have low diversity. And those that do not have invasives or any sort of are free of human disturbance have high. But other than this, like specific habitat types, it's an excellent question.
Well, maybe one being that thinks of meadows is having a lot of flowers, different diversity of flowers. And so one thinks, well, I put that at the top of the list. I'm thinking of native habitats as being not planted and not intensely managed.
So wetland is really high. So in terms of meadow, if it's a pristine meadow, probably is pretty good. But what we see, I'm seeing old field everywhere, which is non-native grasses, vetch red clover, lots of non-natives. Across sites, surveying those old fields, it's about 30% native. Or, you know, let's say 50% native. It's a really non-native dominant. But then you go to a place like Norcross, and it's like 80% native. And there's a huge difference in what you see there versus some of the in a field there with native dominant versus what you'd see in an old field that you're removing invasives. But yeah, those meadow, open meadow, that's the habitat that Bombus fervidus, it goes along with that habitat, you know. But at that scale, it's a good question. I don't have a short answer.
Oak woods and pine woods and
yeah. So let me say that trees as a source of nectar and pollen in the spring are extremely important, and it's hard for me to survey those. So I had a drone up, and I'm trying different ways, and I know that there's some data coming out of Cornell about what's up in trees. I don't know if they're collecting nectar and pollen, so I need that behavioral data to know how they're using the resource, because that's important. But certainly there are, you know, in the spring, those trees. So willow, I can survey because they tend to be on the smaller side. Tremendously important source of nectar and pollen for everything. But trees are important, and just I don't have data on them. I'm not saying, you know, if I don't have data, it's a question mark. I'm not, just because I didn't show something doesn't mean that it's unimportant. It just means that I likely don't have data on it. If I did, I would show it. All right. Well, thank you again.